The world as we know it is the product of great transformations suffered by our land. Many incited to those ancient civilizations that from their social legacy, their specimens of ingenuity, and above all the great lessons and specimens of strength of the human race that have left us. However, while we must recognize the human being as an advanced species with a great potential for evolution and adaptation to physical changes and the various factors presented to us by our environment, there are certain things that leave the gap open to thinking that behind the great wonders of human history there is much more than we believe. Although we have been constantly inquiring into what was the beginning of mankind, there are details that lead us to believe and conceive our starting point much further back than we thought, leaving us room to think about how these ancient civilizations managed not only to survive, but also to establish some of the monuments and magnificent samples of man's building capacity. And it's not about seeing ancient civilizations as societies incapable of being so ingenious or powerful, but many great findings show us how these civilizations sometimes employed very advanced mechanisms and formulas in terms of knowledge. And it is that many of the greatest advances in talking about construction and mechanics came after these societies, but likewise they left their contribution to humanity, one that is remarkable and fascinating. A clear example of this are the famous pyramids of Egypt, which envelop some of the deepest mysteries of humanity. For although for the time they were built, it was normal to see how the effort of thousands of men was directed to a specific task, not even hundreds of these human beings could have been able to move the large stones that make up this monument. This, like other topics, leads us to reflect on what happened in those times and how our peoples could have been helped by civilizations and beings much higher in consciousness and evolution. But it also raises the possibility that our calculations and estimates were wrong, and that our history, in addition to going back to a much older time, also had a different chronological order from what is commonly known. This is why some of the great minds of history have given themselves the task of seeking answers to these and other questions that may end up completely changing what we have as true. Among those great minds, we get Dolores, who, thanks to her innovative work on the regression of lives, has managed to cast struggles over what could actually have happened in these distant times. And it is that from his countless sessions with thousands of patients, he managed to take them on many occasions to the time when these events took place. And what was exposed about them is shocking and transcendent as far as the known history of humanity is concerned. According to known studies, it is estimated that the origin of mankind is about 300 and 200,000 years old, while according to scientific and archaeological evidence, one could speak of an origin of approximately 500,000 years ago. These evidence in the past were taken as isolated phenomena, or as anomalies within research that ended up creating scientific confusion. However, in the face of the recurring presence of these evidence, the dimensions that has finally taken over this topic, they are really important, and they make it impossible for us today to simply reject them. But it is important to pay attention to these little flashes of knowledge about a humanity that has been developing for many more years. It is also important to bear in mind that it is not a small difference that separates this known beginning of humanity from the one that these new evidence indicate. But it is decades of important evolution that could be left aside. And in many respects, this leads us to question the real reason why scientists do not want to assess the possibility that what is held to be true is only a little bit of the top of this great iceberg that represents human history. How much is that which we ignore? And more importantly, why are we ignoring these samples of superior knowledge that exist within human history? And it is that many come to think that it is a fear of having to accept that there are things that we cannot explain from the orthodox conceptions, but that would completely open the gap in understanding that there is many more factors when talking about the evolution of history. And it is that one of the great mysteries that surrounds the history of the Earth is, as already mentioned, the construction of these famous Egyptian pyramids, which have been extensively studied, managing to present many more questions than the few answers that exist. As we know, the height of these pyramids in contrast to the weight of the stones that make up, it does not seem logical or possible to build for the scarce resources and machinery that at that time there was, which has led many to wonder how it is possible that this community ended up mobilizing these parts of that monument of man. Although it is well known that many were the men who dedicated themselves to the construction of these pyramids, according to the calculations and estimates drawn, it is humanly impossible that they could mobilize these stones to build this building in the way in which it was made. And it is precisely its form that also ends up drawing the attention of scientists who appreciate the elaborate way in which these buildings were conceived, and the perfect architectural logic that the Egyptian community had to conceive such a complex and durable structure. As has already been said, it is not a question of questioning the level of ingenuity of humanity, but there are small parts that invite us to think that it was not man alone who conceived and finished building this fascinating work of engineering, which even after so many years remains standing and more solid than ever. Another of the great studies that have been carried out on the materials that make up these buildings of man was the kind of mixture used by these architects and artifacts of ancient civilizations to fixing these large stones, and more than that, to keep them so for the great period that has been seen. According to what has so far been able to clarify, among the ingredients that the concrete of antiquity possesses, there are part of clay, leaves, stick, sweat, and even hair. Not being this the most shocking part of the matter, but that scientists have also stumbled upon substances and unknown compounds that have not been possible to locate on the face of the earth. This is a revelation that has left more than one in total astonishment, for if it's not something we know on Earth, what are those substances that make up this formula? What is its origin? And more importantly, what thing or forms of life brought it to Earth and gave it to this society of distant ages? More than meaningless theories, there are many who think that this is actually the hidden truth behind the history of humanity, and expose that in fact we had help from higher beings in knowledge and consciousness, which leads us to think that in addition to not being alone on Earth, we are also a civilization that has already had in the past its first approaches with other life forms, which can go forward in its evolutionary process. Although many major currents of thought choose to assure that ancient civilizations had in their possession a large pile of knowledge that they ended up carrying with them, the truth is that not only in the case of these pyramids, but of many other imposing monuments of history across the earth, structures and challenging building challenges are evident that leave us wondering whether at some point we have had some support from beings that are not on our planet today. We must bear in mind that it is not only the pyramids of Egypt, but other constructions such as the temples and buildings achieved in certain parts of Latin America and elsewhere in the world that lead us to seek explanations beyond those raised about their design and construction. Why did our ancestors then decide to give it this particular shape? This is another of the great doubts that embarrass the scientific community, because in addition to being forms of construction unusual for the times in which they were erected, they also shine in an ingenuity and an understanding and utilization of the energies and forces of nature that is even superior to what many buildings today possess. We can have before our eyes some of the samples of ingenuity and superior knowledge that we have so much sought over the years, and even be seeing how our ancestors left us a message of cooperation between life forms that many choose to ignore. Within the composition of the large blocks of the pyramids, we also end up finding a shocking revelation, because despite the suspicion that these were made up of limestone, scientists never imagined that these blocks seemed to have been built by man-made, consisting of a mixture in the middle of which air bubbles, insect skeletons, hair and certain compounds that also have their origin in the earth were found. This leads many to wonder what happened after the planning and execution of this building, and how is it possible that this civilization will leave aside the conventional methods of the time to build from scratch, even these parts of the ambitious project that they successfully executed? Something that strongly drew attention to this place is that the buildings were built in irregular positions, as they seemed to have aligned perfectly with the stars, as if seeking through them some sort of exploitation of their energy, light, or any other of the benefits that it can provide. This not only speaks of a resource and natural energy exploitation strategy, but it also speaks about the way in which it seemed that those who led the project had a higher level of knowledge about astronomy, something that was not regular for the time, and that leads us again to think that there was a people or civilization advanced in knowledge that supported and guided our ancestors in building these great ones of majesty. If you combine this with the advanced building techniques they used and the great physical challenges they faced, it seems practically certain that there was an external influence that helped them make these pyramids a perfect work of architecture and ingenuity. And it is that this technique of building the blocks that we mentioned before can only resemble the production of concrete for large constructions, a technique that came to flourish barely in the 80s, distancing quite in time from what was the community responsible for building these famous pyramids of Gaza. But it is not only that which causes great doubts and contradictions among scientists and historians, but that there must also be an explanation to the Sphinx that rises between these buildings, which has very peculiar characteristics that lead us to analyze their construction and that make us again wonder about these techniques of construction of artificial stone and concrete that were employed by these men. Leaving also a space to see how the passage of time and the vestiges of age cause historians and great scholars to have strong complications when determining the age of these monuments coming from the hand of man. In this respect, we must carefully observe the patterns that are presented along this sphincter, which speak of a climate that could be considered in periods prior to which they were fixed as the time of erection of these constructions. The water erosion that is observed in certain parts of this sphincter calls into question the certainty and veracity of the calculations that were in principle made to determine the antiquity of this work, greatly complicating the timelines that scientists raise on humanity, its evolution and the construction of these precious treasures of history and of the planet Earth. What the new archaeological evidence raises could be locating the time of construction of this Sphinx about 12,000 to 13,000 years earlier than thought, which only generates greater fascination when considering the very advanced and sophisticated construction techniques that were employed in these monuments. But this is not only extremely fascinating, but it could support the idea of the life and development of humanity through cycles, or as they were called, the well-known equinoxes, which present us with a moment of profound advance at human level, which follows by a time of great losses, and finally, the rediscovery of our essence and knowledge. This has left more than one breathless, and wondering how much knowledge we have lost throughout human history, because in fact, this is not the only sample of a higher form of civilization than we have in antiquity, but there are also other points of historical interest, such as Antarctica, where very ancient structures have been obtained that cast important data on the history of humanity and civilizations, one that had not been studied in ancient times by those ice sheets that protected them, and that due to the melting of the poles and global warming today, again emerge before our eyes. Thanks to this, and the idea of a cyclical development of humanity, some also pose the possibility that the history of mankind and the Earth as such is much more complicated than we have been allowed to see, rejecting those ideas of linear progression and evolution that we have, and opening ourselves not only to the idea that ancient civilizations had a potential and a higher level of consciousness and wisdom, but also that this knowledge that they possessed belonged to these same men and women. In the light of this knowledge, the human race could be much more ingenious and capable than has been chosen to believe. And although, according to great thinkers like Dolores and others, there are civilizations and living beings that do not live on our own planet and plane, what we have could be more than a sample of interactions between us and those civilizations, a way to understand how human beings have achieved in various parts of history, the perfection of their lifestyles and the alignment of their being with knowledge. Again, this leads us to consider how complex the history of our race could be, and how, without knowing it, we could have been losing great knowledge throughout history. being our destiny, the evolution and imminent destruction and loss of what was built, to find ourselves again in a process of discovering ourselves as humanity. As if it were an infinite cycle of trial and error, these communities, and the vestiges of their passage on Earth, have opened us to see other explanations of what they were, how they chose to live, and how they brought their being to perfection, or even to very close levels of perfection. But this is not only a knowledge that takes place to surprise many, but it makes us reflect on the capacities of human reasoning that remain asleep in this life cycle that we find ourselves going through. And it is that contemplating the artifacts and technologies that were built in these ancient civilizations leads us to understand that man has already managed to master the waters of knowledge and understanding of the universe and of the space in which he lives, designing things that will help him to survive himself under the most comfortable and feasible conditions possible. Contemplating the vestiges of knowledge that these ancient civilizations have been leaving in their way leads many thinkers to consider that the success of our race's survival lies in our ability to observe the ancient civilizations and their knowledge to be able again to take from them the advanced ways of managing the environment and its energies. But not only that, but by contemplating these ancient civilizations and their level of development, we will also be able to see those points where they end up failing and seek to heal those cyclical energy loads that put us once again to the test. Many of the great challenges of modernity can be solved with knowledge and technological developments that reside in ancient civilizations, so we cannot bypass this window of knowledge that our history gives us, much less conform to understanding what humanity has been through from simple, linear perspectives, that according to these evidence is nothing more than a false belief. Just as metaphysics often drives us to believe everything we need could reside deep inside us and remain asleep at the level of consciousness that we are currently managing, we must also give special appreciation to the adaptability and the level of ingenuity that humans can develop, which has shown us in a subtle way in all these historical findings and evidence of our development as humanity. This necessarily leads us to reflection, because from the current perspectives we have had the human being as a form of life that needs constant support from external factors and substances that help him to his purposes, and that drive his abilities to the point of being able to accomplish his task. But what if this was just an illusion, and what we believe we need wasn't actually a necessary part of our lives? What if everything we need and that higher potential were already in us? What if all we need is to recognize our abilities and let our being align with its true essence? Although it sounds a little hard to digest, some of the knowledge that these ancient civilizations are giving us might indicate that in reality, rather than exploring and managing external factors, the key to our success might be to look inside ourselves and unlock that superior ingenuity and inventiveness that we have come equipped with. Each and every one of us is able to understand the universe and to take advantage of the forces and energies it gives us, being these completely sufficient for our subsistence and integral development as individuals, communities, and civilization. If we don't believe it, let's just look at the way these ancient civilizations took and exploited free sources of energy, posing simple solutions to today's big dilemmas. The combination of all these factors and the discovery of these vestiges of history puts us at a turning point in the history of humanity, being able to have the chance of survival that many ancient civilizations did not have. Let us stop for a moment and evaluate. What would happen if everything we require is actually within our being? What if the only thing we really need is to align ourselves with our true essence? These flashes of knowledge could be guiding us towards the answers that we have been asking ourselves for so long, at the same time solving many of the great dilemmas that humanity is dealing with today. Just as at the time our ancestors succeeded in overcoming the survival issues that are developing on our planet, our present society could also have the keys and tools to do so and successfully get out of each of the circumstances that our journey on Earth poses to us. Let us just stop for a second to contemplate what this could mean for us as humanity. For allowing this hypothesis to take place among us would be to throw humanity into exploring its inner side in such a profound way, seeking from there to reconstruct those ideas and beliefs that have long roamed around the corners of the earth. Accepting these postulates also leads us to empower our being to the idea that our thinking and what resides within us possesses a superior capacity than we ourselves have placed it as the maximum point. And although it seems difficult to assimilate or even impossible to conceive for many, these samples of ingenuity and extraordinary abilities that ancient civilizations have given us may be putting before our eyes great answers about what we are and what we can. This also ends up resonating in the ideas of our being about its existence and about the role it plays in the midst of the universe, which may be telling us that in one way or another, everything is aligned with our awakening of consciousness, and so that we take the course of humanity in our hands and succeed in overcoming those pending tests that make us, at the end of each cycle, return again to the starting point of societies and of the human race. That is why it is said that we are at a perfect point of perfection and evolution, because from what we are currently living and the modern conceptions of the human being and the development of societies, we can end up marking the course of humanity. But it also sows us the idea of how technology and advances could be distancing us from our essence and end up causing us more damage to the well-being they provide us, because in a way they cut with that exploration of the world for their understanding and with the growth of the being in wisdom, conditioning it in a subtle way to receive help from external factors, and impressively weakening those abilities that we have within us. Let us remember that all of this arises as a cry from our ancestors not to make the same mistakes as them, giving more importance to the outside and the factors that can favour us than to our own skill and ability to discern. Everything we seek can be contained within us and weakened by the course we are taking from our actions and from our conscious action, which, thanks to a limited view of history, end up being considered correct. The correct interpretation of our development and our history can open the doors to overcoming those issues that ultimately destroyed our societies and that brought them back to their foundations. But this correct interpretation and understanding of human history can push us to adapt to more harmonious social models that at some point in our history have come to be very successful, from which we can guide ourselves to position our society at the point that really is most beneficial to it. We can also take from these civilizations the ways and values that made them such growth, seeking from them to assess whether those values and principles with which we have now aligned ourselves are correct and good for the development of our society and of humanity as such. From this understanding, it is possible to evaluate and correct those aspects that govern today's society, as well as to establish the pillars that will support aspects of our society such as politics, coexistence, and industrial and commercial development. It is precisely in aspects such as these where the evolutionary and scientific aspects of humanity end up intersecting, with the spiritual and transcendental whole covering it, having to understand that the observance of these things is not only oriented to understanding physical aspects, the human being and its earthly development, but it necessarily also leads us to observe the way in which they were conducted at a more energetic and even religious level. As has already been shown, these communities have achieved everything from themselves and from the comprehensive development of their capacities, from the opinions that their interior gave them, especially when it comes to guiding themselves between the earthly aspects. This is why it falls back into our being and how from the alignment with its true essence, it can end up getting its being to expand its abilities in an impressive way, especially as regards our development and our lifestyle. Let us observe how, despite the conditions that arose in those distant times, each of the societies that left us these important messages managed to access a comfortable lifestyle in which the challenges posed to us by the place in which we live were not a limit to achieving the development of great wonders. It can even be appreciated how, at certain points, the topics that presently represent a strong challenge to our society have become tiny in the face of the superior ingenuity and knowledge of these civilizations. But this was only possible from this ability that they apparently developed to align themselves with their soul, with true knowledge, and to open themselves to exploring their abilities and taking them out to the benefit not only of each individual, but of the society in which they lived. At this point, we might be called upon to break those limits that we perceive in the outside world, and from there give release to our being, to let out its skills and knowledge that we internally have the ability to develop and demonstrate. The destiny of mankind could largely be linked to the capacity of self-discovery and commitment to our essence, not being the task of a few, but of all and each of the individuals that inhabit this plane. Although we have for years rejected this knowledge and this way of life, these historical vestiges may again be giving us signs that the true path is one that has drawn a life more aligned with the spiritual and the true form of our being. But this is seriously threatened by those technological factors that, as we have already mentioned, seem to be taking our being and limiting it, affecting the development of its capabilities, and sleeping our being in a way that might be condemning us. In this regard, many have argued that humanity might be facing a difficult test that makes us have to choose between our capacities as humans and those help and comfort that new technologies provide. However, we must not forget that however convenient a space may present itself, this does not mean that it is finally the best for us. And in fact, we might be being deceived to be led to our destruction again. Leaving aside our potential and our capabilities necessarily implies handing over our society, our living space and all of humanity into the hands of machines and artifacts created by man. This, in turn, is pushing us to believe that handing everything over to technology makes us lose our human capacity and those biological potentials with which we were created, thus losing the ability to use them in our favour and becoming subject to technologies performing works of personal development on our behalf, which will eventually not produce the desired effect, stalling us in the middle of our process and most likely causing our end to perish in the same way as the ancient civilizations. Although the past is not a time when we can act or that has the greatest benefit from being brought to the present, it is necessary in cases like these to look back, to remember the mistakes made in the midst of managing humanity and its civilizations, seeing how large societies that have reached very high in terms of development ended up perishing for small details that we as individuals and as society are now in a position to refine to not repeat. Today we can be those who mark our prevalence on this plane, or the culmination of a cycle to restart the whole evolutionary process that we know, and only in ourselves is the determination to continue to emit these deep understanding that history gives us, or simply continue to ignore and give room to the restart of everything for man. Let us remember how in the midst of our growth, and the ambition of growth in the scientific aspect, has led us to carry out experiments that go against the balance of the energies. And the natural, a clear example of this, have been those attempts to replicate the action of God in the middle of creation, trying to clone the organisms that from his divine power he created. We also see how man has tried to create from the synthetic, organic parts of being, which instead of building an improvement for our lives, could be breaking with that delicate balance that exists on our planet and in the universe. We cannot simply leave aside those aspects that make us human, because although we are not sure that it is what destroys these so advanced and solid civilizations, this could be one of the aspects which, when left aside, condemn us to be taken back to our foundations to start again with that cycle of discovery and evolution. If these great and astonishing buildings were left as a message by our ancestors, their contemplation can only make us come into reflection, for what they are telling us is that undoubtedly the human being has the ability to everything that he wants and proposes, only with the internalization of his being and the parts that make up him, because by aligning with his true essence and the way in which he was created, he can manage to transcend those barriers and those limits that he perceives from the outside. However, this cannot be taken as an unlimited capacity to destroy the natural, for the key to our prevalence will undoubtedly be the way in which we learn to be in harmony with the energies of the universe, while flowing with them to make the most of everything that surrounds and nourishes us. One thing is to take advantage of the forces and energies that exist in the place where we live, and another very different one is to challenge the limits of their power, seeking our technological advances to succeed in replacing the important role they play in our environment. That is what, in the opinion of many, ends up making human beings see their greatest advances reduced to mere ruins, some that we now contemplate with great astonishment, and that leave us completely amazed at the level of knowledge and technique that had those civilizations that we chose to see as inferior, but that actually reached the highest in terms of lifestyle for the kind of conditions that surrounded it. As has already been said, our success lies in aligning ourselves with ourselves, but also in knowing how to coexist in harmony with everything that surrounds us, giving each one their space and the importance that corresponds to their role. We are urged to nourish ourselves with the true knowledge that many civilizations have already managed to use in their favor, but we are also invited to take that knowledge and know how to recognize their flaws in order to be able to overcome the challenges that have caused them to perish. And if you, like these great minds, think that everything we see as a memory of past civilizations is an important message to humanity to reconnect with its essence, please don't hesitate to let me know with a like. Likewise, I ask you to go through the comments and give us your opinion about those ancient civilizations that have been marking the way for us to reach the present point. If you liked this content, please subscribe and activate notifications to be up to date with the new editions we are preparing for you, where we will reveal more important knowledge in the midst of our earthly and spiritual development. We'll see you next time. Until then, I invite you to reflect and connect with yourself.